Well, with the intense load shedding, the huge push for new sources of power, also a focus on the situation around solar power. We understand you can build a solar power plant in about 2 years. Eskom, as we know, are hoping to get more electricity from solar power plants in the near future. Chris Hall is the Executive Director of the Solar Group. I think he can work out where they get their power from. Chris, good afternoon to you. You've been involved in setting up these plants. You have to go through the regulatory processes, the financing process. How long does it take from the moment someone says, let's build a solar power plant, to it actually delivering electricity?
Good afternoon, Stephen. It's a long process. I think the project that we recently brought to financial close, which is a 200 megawatt solar project that's completely bilateral, private to private solar power contracts, has taken us about 2 years to get to the point where we've reached financial close, and we've now got an 18-month build program to bring it on stream when the electrons finally flow. I've been in this industry now for about 12 years, having started our company in South Africa 12 years ago, and we've been involved in all forms of the energy procurement sector, from developing some of the first IPPs that were contracted with government, to building some of the first 1 megawatt rooftop systems that created bilateral agreements with municipalities, to the first wheeling contract with Amazon, and now the first major sort of 200 megawatt wheeling contracts with large scale commercial energy users. And the industry it's a difficult place to operate because it takes a long time to procure projects. And I noticed in some of the conversations previously in your news editorial there, people were talking about onboarding IPPs and bringing on procurement of IPPs. But it's a complicated process to buy energy at this scale. And hopefully, actually, what we've achieved with this last project is really setting a precedent to allow that to happen a lot faster and a lot quicker. And I'm very confident, actually, that with having set this precedent and sort of opened up the large-scale financing of these types of projects, that we'll see many more of them coming on stream. There's a huge demand for this type of electricity, and there's actually a huge supply of shovel-ready projects to be built. The contracting is complicated. It does take time, and the financing obviously is very difficult, because we're talking about billions of rands that have to be invested and borrowed into these project companies. But once the precedent has been set and that learning starts to gather momentum, things can happen a lot faster, provided it's not disrupted. And that actually was the big problem that we had previously with the IPP program, which was gaining momentum and then was unfortunately disrupted quite suddenly by Eskom's obsession with nuclear power at the time.
So it seems to me then, regulation doesn't necessarily seem to be the problem. The problem is financing, and as I understand it, it's also got more expensive to buy the actual parts, the solar panels, the bits that, make up the solar panels. So is the problem financing? I would have thought there's quite a lot of capital in South Africa available for this kind of thing.
No, there's lots of capital available. There's obviously a lot of interest in trying to invest in this type of infrastructure. People know there's a big demand and a big shortage of electricity. So that's, taking an idea from let's build a solar project to actually closing and drawing down the billions of rands required to do the construction obviously requires a huge amount of due diligence and legal contracts that have to be put in place. Every single T has to be crossed, every I has to be dotted in order for that to actually happen. And that takes a huge amount of time. It also requires a huge amount of experience from a lot of different people involved in different aspects of that project, from the technical selection of equipment to dealing with the grid connection, to understanding the amount of radiation that's available in an area, to working out the output of the facility, to working out how the loans actually work and the financing is repaid and over what period of time. And all that requires a lot of analysis and expertise. This last transaction, there were probably about 170 legal technical experts involved in actually closing the deal, which happened last Friday, to get it to fruition. So it is a complicated process, but I think once financiers, in particular the senior lenders, are more comfortable with that process, it can go quicker, and obviously the people involved become more experienced in actually dealing with the transaction. So financing is not the problem. I think what I would say is a problem at the moment is the access to the network and the time it takes for Eskom to actually provide unconditional approval to connect into the network. And at scale, that is actually a difficult thing to achieve at the moment. There's a process that Eskom has laid out in order to apply for a connection into the network, where you have to get a cost estimate letter and you eventually convert that into a budget quotation, and finally you get a set of connection agreements at the end of that process. But that process from start to finish it takes somewhere in the region of 12 to 18 months, and also requires a lot of expense. There's the cost estimate letter itself, just the initial application is 120,000 Rand, which only gives you a very rough estimate for what that connection is going to be. So I would say there should be a strong focus from governments and Eskom to providing more resources into that grid connection, grid access unit, providing more engineering, technical capabilities, perhaps even onboarding some consultants to help manage the inundation that Eskom has had for applications, because they have had a huge increase in the number of applications, and allowing them to process those applications in an accurate way and in a faster way to get to the point where we actually have real credible connections onto the network that are properly engineered, properly costed, and done in the quickest possible time frame.
Chris, it's interesting to hear you talk, because we get a sense of the complexity of this. I think for most of us who just consume electricity, we just want the thing to work, man. It's as simple as that. And when you hear you talk about the complexity of it, we can see how difficult it is. There's a different question, which is I sometimes wonder, and maybe it's just my frustration coming through, if people in government, if the regulator, if Eskom, get how serious all of this is and what it's doing to the country, because we just don't feel the urgency from government or from the ministers or whoever. When you speak to people, do you feel the urgency? I don't want to put you in a difficult position. You have to sign contracts with these people. Do you think there is a sense of urgency to fix these problems?
No, I do believe there is a sense of urgency. I think everyone in government in the whole country is obviously. I mean, you could hear it on the news reports. It's a desperate situation that everybody is aligned to try and resolve. And I think government are, it's on the foremost of their agenda. But they're also in a very, very difficult position, because these things don't happen quickly. It requires a lot of momentum to be built up in such a procurement process at scale, and it requires a lot of confidence from the market in the procurement process to trust that a process is going to work. And unfortunately, the procurement program that government was running to bring more megawatts onto the network went through a very difficult hiatus for many years. I'm sure your listeners and you are quite well aware of how the IPP program was derailed. And that lack of confidence and uncertainty has proved it very difficult to reinstate that program. I mean, the government have been trying to procure more megawatts onto the network now for the last 2 or 3 years through the same program, but they actually haven't been able to get many megawatts connected at all. And because there's a certain amount of momentum and confidence that gets built up, and unfortunately those things don't happen overnight. It takes time to get all the different participants in such a market to really believe that the program is going to happen. It costs a lot of money to participate in such a program, and I think what's happened now is that the governments have got themselves a little bit with their backs against the wall in terms of realizing that it doesn't happen overnight, and that confidence needs to be rebuilt. And that's partly why we're also very excited about this type of contract that we've just closed here, which is actually it's not relying on government procurement. It's not actually relying much on government regulation at all. In fact, it's relying on the lack of government regulation and the opening up of the regulation around generation licenses, which has allowed two private entities, ourselves and Tronox Mineral Sands in this case, which use 1 billion kilowatt hours of electricity in the country every year, to strike an agreement for us to sell them power at a rate which is considerably less than what they would be buying it from Eskom for. So despite the increases in solar power and the concerns that you mentioned there, we're still able to sell that energy at a considerable discount, both saving money for them and also bringing more electrons onto the network, and green electrons, which is a very important aspect for an international company such as Tronox, which is listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So there are a lot of positives to these types of projects, and although I think the government program, it's a good program to keep at and to try and resurrect, I think there should be a lot of emphasis placed on trying to facilitate more projects like this, which can happen a lot quicker and without government intervention, and also actually without interfering with the government's balance sheet, which is also a very important part of the energy market, the challenges that we face as a country.
Chris Hall, thank you very much indeed, Executive Director at the Solar Group. Very clear explanation of some of the problems. Well,